morning and welcome. I'm Janet Ward, Professor of History and the Faculty Director of the OU Humanities Forum. I'm so pleased that you could join us here today for the University of Oklahoma's annual teach-in, focusing this time on the First World War. Thank you, Philip Jenkins, for opening our first session with that wonderful talk. Our second speaker today is Heather Perry, the author of the 2014 book with the University of Manchester Press, Recycling the Disabled, Army, Medicine, and Modernity in World War I Germany. Her current book project, Feeding War, Gender, Health, and Mobilization in World War I Germany, examines the history of food, nutritional health, and biopolitics on Germany's home front during the First World War. Professor Perry serves on the editorial board of the University of North Georgia's Press, the World War I Centennial Book Series. She's currently an associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Heather Perry.
Thank you, Janet, for the introduction, and also to everyone here at the University of Oklahoma, especially to Kevin Butterfield and Kyle Harper for the invitation to speak today, Sarah Soule for taking care of the arrangement, and to President David Boren and the Institute for American Constitutional Heritage for making this possible. It's an honor and a delight to be here, part of this event, and I thank you as well for your participation. Well, when we talk about the First World War being a modern industrialized war, we tend to think of this in terms of the weapons and the way in which that facilitated a shift in war. But today I want to suggest to you that when we talk about modern industrialized warfare, we also need to include in that the category of medicine. When I was working on my recent book, as Janet mentioned, a study of medicine and wounded soldiers, people would often assume that I focused on shell shock and the development of psychotherapy, or that I was looking at these first instances of chemical warfare and the treatments for the phosgene or mustard gas that they used. And in some ways this is understandable, I think, because of the novelty of these injuries and the inadequacy of military medicine to treat them. They have attracted and continue to attract a lot of attention. But in fact, the majority of soldiers' wounds in this war came from quite conventional weapons, artillery and firearms. Most male bodies were invaded with bullets, shrapnel, or other uncontrollable flying debris. And according to one German casualty report, 63.5% of these were only injuries to limbs. And so, over the course of the war, the armies of the European belligerents suffered unprecedented casualties, and I'm just kind of throwing up some statistics up there. And these figures may pale when we compare them to those in the Second World War, but at the time they were simply astronomical. Only the Russian army suffered more casualties than the German, and those staggering figures triggered both mutiny within the Russian army and a revolution on the Russian home front, ultimately bringing her out of the war. Of the nations who battled until November 1918, only the Germans suffered the highest total casualties. That's those killed, wounded, and missing in action. But actually, for Germany, the first year of the war saw the heaviest casualties, some 486,000. And those casualties actually decreased with the evolution of trench warfare along the Western Front. Thus, we can see why by late 1914, the Empire's doctors found themselves running as low on medical supplies as the nation's arsenals were on munitions. Governments and high commands everywhere had underestimated not just the quantity of weapons they would need in this war, but also the quantity of injuries that these weapons would create. Not surprisingly, then, a widespread medical mobilization of every nation followed quickly on the heels of the military one as governments scrambled to respond to these casualties. This is how the Munich orthopedist Fritz Lange found himself with the Bavarian army in Cambrai setting up a field hospital in the north of France. improvising strategies and tools for treating the wounded, even bending table forks into surgical retractors at one point. Within 5 months, he had consolidated these early wartime experiences into a field manual for sanitation officers entitled War Orthopedics. And within its pages, he detailed how and why he was convinced that with some modifications, his marginal medical specialty, orthopedics, was the one best suited to responding to the Empire's wartime medical crisis. He outlined the best techniques for setting splints, bandaging compound fractures, prepping the wounded for transport, making use of physical therapy, and even fitting amputees for prostheses, all modified orthopedic procedures and techniques which he had developed during his experiences. His goal with the manual was to educate sanitation officers on how to place these innovations in the service of the nation's wounded, and it was crucial, he opined, because as far as he was concerned, orthopedics was all that stood between the German Empire and what he termed the threatening epidemic of crippledom. Long was not alone in his concerns about this sudden generation of war-disabled soldiers that seemed to loom before the nation. You see, before this war, the majority of soldiers, or even civilians, who sustained such severe injuries usually died. Yet by the early 20th century, modern medicine had developed new surgical and antiseptic procedures so that they could now save the lives of those soldiers who might have been lost to gangrene, infection, or disease in previous wars. We should keep in mind that antibiotics had not yet been discovered. This means that once infection set in, there was no cure for it. In fact, the only remedy really was to hope that it might heal itself, but what they usually did was to cut it out, hence amputation. Yet the alarming rate at which soldiers were being wounded in battle meant that these recent medical innovations were ensuring the survival of thousands and thousands of severely injured men, far more than any nation could have imagined or could cope with. And just to give you an example, by January of 1915, 6 months into the war, 30,000 disabled German soldiers had already returned. What would become of all of these disabled men? The handful of soldiers' homes built in the wake of Germany's wars of unification did not have room for them. Moreover, the meager rank-based war pensions they stood to receive would hardly replace the income of a highly trained worker, a skilled craftsman, or an educated professional who had been wounded as a private or a corporal. How would these wounded warriors survive? Thus, Lange and other cripple care experts, as they called themselves, began to rethink their medical goals and ultimately decided to do more than simply save these men's lives. They determined to restore their bodies. As one leading Berlin orthopedist noted in a 1915 public speech meant to reassure Germans that the nation's soldiers were receiving the best medical care available to them. We cannot, as in previous eras, allow these wounded and crippled men to go around the street as organ grinders or peddlers. We cannot let them run around as beggars. We must take care that they become once more upright, self-sufficient, the upright, self-sufficient men that they were before the war. Well, this idea to create economically and physically self-sufficient Germans from those who at the time many considered to be simply useless cripples was actually a radical one in Imperial Germany. To repair and return the permanently injured body to the workforce rather than to simply compensate its owner with a pension fundamentally challenged the practices which had evolved under the path-breaking insurance system set in place by Bismarck in the 1880s. Pensions, not medical rehabilitation, were how they treated severe injury in Germany. Yet Lange, Biesalski, and other health professionals were determined to return to these men what the war had taken from them, a free and independent existence. Well, this shift in medical goals of orthopedic medicine necessitated one in prosthetic technology as well. As orthopedists quickly realized, the few prosthetic devices available to them before the war, peg legs or simple hooks such as these, were of little use in sending men back into the industrial workforce. These crude implements returned little function and offered even less in cosmetic value. Those artificial limbs that did focus on masking disability, called Sunday arms because they were what men wore to church, were even less useful. In order to return the disabled then to the workforce, orthopedists realized that they would have to create new implements for replacing or augmenting the soldier's body. In developing these new limbs, German orthopedists turned to engineers and so-called scientists of work, efficiency experts who specialized in harmonizing the physical movements of the human body to the increasingly mechanized workspace in industrial capitalism. They sought help in analyzing the various movements of the human body and studying the motions necessary to perform the tasks in different occupations. By distilling these tasks into a series of different key movements, they sought to determine which particular functions a worker had lost and enlisted engineers' help in creating devices capable of performing them. And this is just one of hundreds of grip studies that were done to sort of figure out what is it that the human hand needs to do and how to replicate that. Well, over the course of the war, they invented some 300 different devices, limbs, legs, and other aids as part of returning soldiers to the workforce. And thus, whereas in 1914, Flyers and catalogs advertised devices which might help the severely injured accomplish such tasks as eating or washing up. And in addition to those products, you might also find specially designed clothing, including trousers, work aprons, or a prosthesis jacket. Advertisements in the back pages of the museum exhibits offered specially crafted typewriters or pens for the one-armed, or even extra inserts for artificial limb holsters that the men could purchase on their own through a private manufacturer. So all of what I'm trying to say here is that whereas before the war, disabled Germans had been considered helpless beings, incapable of work and dependent upon care and welfare, this new war-disabled body was one which could be made independent and economically self-sufficient, thanks to the intervention of modern medical technology. Moreover, in their medical publications and the materials they aimed at the general population, these new rehabilitation experts were putting the disabled soldier forward as a man with a fully restored body who did not need to burden the state by drawing welfare benefits. Rather, he was portrayed as one who could, indeed patriotically should, choose to support it through his contributions to the national economy. Thus, this invention of disability was a cultural and sociological shift in the nation's perception of what and how the body could be understood, a shift that was made necessary by the unprecedented casualties of the war and made possible by modern industrialized medicine. And we could end this story there. In many ways, what I've just told you fits very neatly into what one of our most commonly accepted and widely held beliefs about war, which is that despite its terrible destruction, it often has these good byproducts, medical advancements, and that if we just stay there, that might be the story we would walk away with. But if we look deeper into Germany's experience, we find that this shift had much broader implications. Indeed, as the war continued much longer than anyone had expected, nearly all belligerent nations faced an increasing manpower dilemma. On the one hand, their armies were in constant need of fresh, able-bodied soldiers to replace those men wounded and killed in battle. On the other hand, the demands of industrial warfare and strategies designed to bleed the enemy white meant that industries on the home front needed all the labor available and more in order to keep their soldiers supplied with weapons. Of course, for Great Britain, France, and other allies, countries with vast overseas empires, the solution was simply to import both human and natural resources in order to keep the war going. For Germany, however, this was not an option. Isolated from their colonies and other sources of trade due to the strict Allied blockade, by 1916, German military and industry leaders were locked in a struggle over manpower. Looking for alternative sources of labor, as you well know, many factories turned to women and the youth of both sexes with the idea of employing them until the war was over. Some, such as Siemens, took the medical successes in disabled soldier care and went one step further down the line. In late 1916, the Siemens Schuckertwerk, the same company that had developed this universal arm, offered its own company infirmary as a convalescing hospital for wounded soldiers. By then, of course, many of the private, state, and university hospitals were overfilling with casualties, and private institutions and organizations on the home front put their own facilities up in the service of the nation's wounded. For Siemens, however, this was not a completely altruistic act. For in volunteering their infirmary to the government, they were also gaining immediate access to a potential new source of labor, the disabled soldier. And they soon began experimenting with his labor in their factories. During the war, engineers at Siemens published a number of articles touting their success at reintegrating disabled soldiers into the workplace. They argued that the tasks these soldiers performed as part of their normal job duties actually mirrored quite well the physical movements and exercises in this new rehabilitation medicine. Indeed, work therapy, as one treatment was called, had been conceived to help restore the injured soldiers' bodies through controlled, repetitive movement of the injured body part. But until 1916, this kind of rehabilitation therapy was supposed to be expertly directed and overseen by orthopedists in specially constructed clinics. At Siemens, however, managers argued that they had found ways to integrate disabled soldiers into the workplace using factory machinery as substitutes for the medical contraptions that patients might have used in hospital. They argued that in the case of men like B or STEA. The work that they were performing in the factory was actually therapeutic, and it helped to regenerate their nerves and tendons, ultimately aiding them in their recovery. Of course, the byproduct of this therapy, the munitions and other war material that the men were producing, was obviously benefiting the nation's war effort. Siemens also tested the use of blinded labor in their factories. Through their experiments, they discovered that men blinded in war were particularly well suited for munitions production. In particular, they were good at testing gauges, assembling cartons, packing fuse plugs, assembling interlocking nuts and bolts, testing the threads of bolts, testing fuses, and of course, running motorized machinery. One report issued by the firm claimed that blinded soldiers were particularly optimal for these tasks because, as ex-soldiers, they had a practical working knowledge not only of the materials they were constructing, but also how they would be used in war. Unlike civilian workers who had never seen or used these devices, ex-soldiers, even blind ones, they argued, had an intimate familiarity with the objects they were manufacturing. Beyond this asset, engineers at Siemens were convinced that the blindness gave these men an edge. The same report pointed out that often the blind worker earns more than his seeing counterpart because he is not distracted from his work. Well, gifted or not, it seems pretty clear that Siemens and the multiple other factories who used blind and disabled soldiers saw them as representing a steady and usable supply of much-needed labor. Moreover, by employing and housing disabled soldiers, Siemens was keeping these men out of the convalescent homes or welfare institutions that might otherwise have been responsible for their welfare. No small service for a home front population struggling to feed itself, and a military administration overwhelmed with casualties. Still, while the original goal of orthopedists' new medical mission had been to enable the disabled soldier to return to his pre-war life, while also making him self-sufficient, at Siemens it seems pretty obvious that employing the war disabled was informed by the practical economics of military industrial production as much as it was by improving the soldiers' welfare. Indeed, perhaps emboldened by these successes, the head engineer at Siemens began loudly recommending that severely injured soldiers who had not yet been discharged from active duty be commandeered into one of the work therapy programs at Siemens. After all, he argued, it was in the soldiers' best interest. Well, while the manpower shortage in industrial production had become increasingly keen during the war, it was not the only sector of the wartime economy in trouble. The shortage of labor in Germany's farmlands was perhaps even more desperate. Many of the empire's agricultural regions lacked adequate manpower for tilling and harvesting fields, husbanding animals, or working dairy farms. This rural labor shortage, combined with the Allied blockade of all imports, had contributed to a growing scarcity of foods and the implementation of a strict rationing system. Thus, it may not surprise you that by the end of 1916, doctors, engineers, local mayors, businessmen, and even one northern fishery manager were advocating ways that disabled soldiers could be put to use in farming and other agricultural-related work. Take, for instance, the Association for the Development of Marshlands in the German Empire. This was a voluntary organization that wanted to distribute small farming settlements, which they called colonies, to disabled soldiers to help them secure their own economic independence. After soil improvement cooperatives had used the forced labor of POWs to recultivate the barren wastelands on the Eastern Front, the association had some 135,000 hectares of land which they were ready to give to disabled soldiers. They argued that settling the soldier on these new homesteads was more than just providing him with the means to be independent, to grow his own food, and even to once again provide for his family. They also saw in them the potential to increase the national food supply as well. Other agricultural experts agreed resettling disabled soldiers into garden plots and farming colonies in the East Prussian borderlands was an excellent solution to many problems facing the wartime empire. Of course, working in the fresh air had a healing and revitalizing effect on the body, they argued, and steering disabled soldiers would aid in the restoring of their health and fitness, but they were also convinced that rabbit raising and beekeeping would be easy vocations for the disabled and would also, by the way, provide much-needed resources for the wartime nation: protein and honey. In Saxony, a voluntary civic organization, the Settlement Society for German Soldiers, took all of this even further, linking the settlement projects to their own national visions of territorial expansion and reclamation. They argued that among the many advantages of resettling the disabled soldiers in the borderlands on the Eastern Front in the Oberost, what is now like Latvia, which I've kind of already mentioned, they also thought it was necessary to colonize this area with disabled soldiers so that these ex-servicemen might be a national bulwark against the land-hungry Muscovites to the east. Well, as you may imagine, all of these private efforts in medical, industrial, and agricultural circles in 1916 did not go unnoticed. And in 1917, the Ministry of War implemented a number of new policies designed to help the nation make use of the labor potential in her injured and disabled soldiers. One decree ordered that all recuperating soldiers be made available for potential mustering. This included the immediate relocation of all wounded men to orthopedic hospitals where they would learn how to better adapt their convalescing bodies to new trades. Severely injured and disabled soldiers no longer fit for military service were not discharged, but were instead sorted out and sent to training hospitals for rehabilitation and eventual reassignment in war industries. And those who refused to cooperate or take up such work were to be commandeered to it under military orders. By late 1917, fit male workers on the home front who could be replaced by a newly restored disabled soldier could no longer apply for draft exemption, and injured soldiers on convalescent leave in military hospitals were required to promptly register with the local mustering committee in case they could be used while temporarily there. The Saxon army even took this one step further, creating in 1917 its so-called Wirtschaftsbataillonen. These were economic battalions of disabled soldiers who were kept at the ready and could be quickly mobilized to a particular war industry. And here what you see is just one War Office order that makes the requisitioning of disabled soldiers available to nearby farmers. By 1918, disabled soldiers not engaged in wartime auxiliary service could be not only commandeered to it, but they could be called for treason. They could be tried for treason, so-called crimes against the fatherland, if they refused to go back to work in the war economy, as could the doctors who failed to help them. Though initially demobilized upon severe injury, what we see is, after the turning point of 1916, the medical advancements developed early in the war ultimately allowed the German Supreme War Office to reuse, or to borrow the word that they used, to recycle these men. Well, what does all of this mean? After all, Germany lost the war. So we could argue that the manpower reclaimed from these advancements could not compete with the human and material resources that the Americans bring over in 1918. The German Empire was collapsing, her armies retreating, her emperor abdicating. This might prompt some to conclude that all of this medical innovation to recycle the soldiers was a failure. But I disagree. I think we see a number of important things here. One of those is that we see, just as this was a war of industrialized weapons, it was also a war of industrialized medicine. And in the case of Germany, medical professionals and military men are not simply treating disabled soldiers after injury, but they're actually becoming part of the war machine. What we see is the centrality of medicine for the German army, the German high command, to continue to wage war. I also think we see a kind of industrialization of medicine, the way in which a kind of slick system, an assembly line of thinking of soldiers and men and disabled bodies as easily repairable and interchangeable. So that even if the orthopedists were not, through their efforts, able to achieve the empire's military goals, they were able to parlay their wartime work into significant gains. We also see this in the policies of the Weimar Republic, the new state which emerged from the ashes of the German Empire. By positioning themselves as experts in the care of soldiers during the war, orthopedists had actually acted as professional entrepreneurs, using the war as a moment to transform their discipline from a marginalized medical field to one of crucial national importance. And what's quite interesting is that by 1917, in fact, the Ministry of War had to issue an order banning the dissemination of any information about prosthetics or orthopedic developments. They had it on good authority that the British government is showing great interest in our achievements in artificial limbs and expending all efforts to acquire it. So thus, by mid-1917, artificial limb and rehabilitation technology had become a matter of national security, and these designs were being counted among Germany's wartime state secrets. Secrets which, by the way, the Americans were also very interested in. In late 1916, several military medical men were sent in covertly as humanitarian medical volunteers. Right? This is before the U.S. enters the war, because of their neutrality. And what they did was to gather information about Germany's medical mobilization. Later, they published these in a 1917-1918 pamphlet called Lessons from the Enemy. Lessons which, the pamphlet's author argued, were crucial for the United States to study and learn from. And as some of you will know, they did. In anticipation of the disabled soldiers who would eventually return to America after their entry into the war in 1917, the U.S. government formed the Veterans Bureau. It's part of putting together a system of care, treatment, and rehabilitation for disabled soldiers before they could overwhelm the nation. Yet beyond this attention from our enemies that these biomedical rehabilitative lessons attracted, these innovations fundamentally transformed the lives of disabled Germans. In the new Republic, treatment regimens and therapies which had developed during the war for Germany's disabled soldiers were quickly extended to all citizens. The new law for the severely disabled, passed in 1920, combined the care and welfare of injured veterans with that of so-called peace cripples, civilians who had been disabled through accidents during or even before the war. Thus, the programs, which had been initially created specifically for soldiers, men whose bodily sacrifices were deemed so great that they deserved something better than what the nation could offer in 1914, now trickled down to the civilian population, giving them essentially access to what we now would call modern rehabilitation, something which no one had before the war. Moreover, this cultural shift in attitudes towards disabled bodies helped severely injured Germans reclaim the social and civic space from which they had been excluded before 1914. The war generated scores of public lectures, exhibitions, popular publications, and consumer items, all of which were geared towards improving the life of the disabled soldier. Whether facilitating his return to work or increasing his acceptance in society, by re-educating his able-bodied compatriots, all of this wartime activity was that veterans or not, disabled Germans became more visible, visible as consumers, visible as workers, and visible as part of the public sphere. Many cities posted announcements in public spaces urging fellow citizens to make allowances for the war invalid, allowing him to go to the head of the line, giving him their seats in trains. In Berlin and Aachen in 1917, special train compartments had been reserved especially for the war disabled so that he could get easy access to transportation to and from work. And after the war, these remained. Thus, in the aftermath of the war, disabled Germans in the Weimar Republic were no longer invisible, no longer hidden away in homes or institutions. They weren't considered helpless. They weren't considered deserving of pity or public charity, or even full-time government support. Rather, they were fully fledged members of society capable of caring for themselves and for others, all while contributing towards the common good and the wealth of the nation. All a modern understanding of disability, a new understanding which would actually prove catastrophic for some after the Nazi seizure of power. Thank you.